After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations, we pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Diplomacy is really hard, and the Trump administration clearly isn't up to it. They've fired experts from across the federal government, including 1,300 from the State Department in Elon Musk's Doge purge. They installed MAGA loyalists in their place when they've replaced them at all. There is still no US ambassador to Australia, for example. If you Google it, the US Embassy website still tells you that it's Caroline Kennedy, who left the role in 2024. This deliberate destruction of federal government capacity is how you wind up with someone like JD Vance running the show.
The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
The Trump administration's failure to reach an agreement with Iran over the weekend shouldn't come as a surprise. These are complicated negotiations at the best of times. And given the US government didn't even have a plan to evacuate its own citizens from the region after it launched this illegal war, it's fair to say these aren't the best of times. After threatening genocide last week, Trump is now threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, the major global shipping choke point that Iran has already closed. The desperation is getting louder. This week, I'm joined by a friend of the show, Allan Behm, Australia Institute Advisor in International and Security Affairs. We recorded on Friday the 10th of April, before the Pakistan-mediated talks took place. We spoke about why those negotiations were likely to fail, the consequences of a walkout, Trump's genocidal threats, and what this could mean for US allies, including Australia. Allan, thank you so much for joining us on the show in such a fraught time. It's lovely to have you here.
Well, Emma, thank you for having me back on.
It's always a pleasure, Allan. Now, I have to do that podcast thing where I make really clear that we are recording at 11:15 in the morning on Friday, Australian time, and things are moving even more quickly than they usually are with the Trump administration. Things are changing from moment to moment. With that hedging in mind, it being Friday morning, Allan, could you give us your version of events and what just happened? You know, it's so extraordinarily difficult to even get the timeline right, given how fast everything is moving, and also given that basically everybody involved is lying constantly. So what's your version of what we've seen unfold over the last week or so?
Emma, in a funny way, I don't think anything's changed. Everything has happened and nothing's happened. It's chaotic. It has any number of moving parts, and new moving parts come in and go out all the time. One moment is going to be whether or not the Iranians are going to impose tolls on ships going in and out. Another moment is that they're not. Nobody has said yet that President Trump just imposed tariffs on everybody, which is a kind of toll. So why shouldn't the Iranians impose tolls on people whom they don't like or do like or whatever? The whole thing at the moment, I think, Emma, is particularly volatile. It's particularly fragile. And I think for those two reasons, it's particularly perilous. And so I can't tell you why it is like what it is, and nor have I got any sharp idea about where it's going to go. I've got the glimmerings of ideas about what might be the best possible outcome at the moment, given what we've got. And I can certainly list a few really awful outcomes, which I think are just as probable. So the sort of short answer to your question is, I think, that nobody knows what the dynamics are of this particular situation, least of all those who are principally engaged in it.
I think you're absolutely right, Allan. And I mean, Trump himself made that clear, really, I think, throughout this process, if we can even call it that. We had the President of the United States quite literally threatening to commit a genocide and putting a deadline on that. And then apparently, I don't know if we should even describe it as backing down, but he then announced that he had this ceasefire deal with the Iranian regime, apparently based on a 10-point plan that was provided by the regime even 2 days before that the United States had rejected, but then Trump had accepted. So we're just in this incredible mess. But in that announcement of the ceasefire, that confusion and exactly what you were describing just became clear, because the Pakistani PM who brokered the ceasefire made it explicit in his announcement that Lebanon was included in the ceasefire. The Iranian regime clearly thought that Lebanon was also included in the ceasefire. Netanyahu then straight away said, no, it's not, and initiated a huge wave of strikes. And to get back to your earlier point, it seemed that Trump hadn't even really thought about it. He hadn't mentioned Lebanon, and then he described it as a separate skirmish. Can it be true that the President of the United States is not thinking about these issues or is not aware of them?
Most certainly, because I think everything that we know about President Trump is that the starting point and ending point of all consideration is himself.
Mm.
So long as he's involved in negotiating the deal, and the word deal, I think, is the talisman here. It tells you all you need to know, because we're not really approaching a deal of any kind. You can't have a deal with as many moving parts or as complicated as this. You have a series of interlocking accommodations, if you're lucky, and a few standoffs if you can't get the accommodations. But that's not how President Trump thinks at all. And even those of us who can remember his lamentable performances as a TV star, and he still thinks he's a TV star. I mean, look at the way in which he walks into the room in the Oval Office when he's about to make a press announcement, that sort of strange pointing at members of the press gallery as though he's either skewering them or giving them the wonderful benefit of being recognised. I mean, who knows what that's really all about, except a kind of attention seeking and a statement of, I'm here. So I don't think you judge President Trump by the standards of most normal international leaders. I think you judge him by the standards of President Trump: solipsistic, narcissistic, deeply internally focused, and his own presence and his own ability to move on to some other fantasy is the defining moment of whatever progress might be. So he can claim victory out of defeats because he doesn't recognise them as defeats. I mean, he's got a totally private epistemology. And that is the classical definition of an idiot.
Which is terrifying in itself, and brings me to my next question. I mean, I suspect I know the answer given what you've just said, but I keep getting asked, when I'm talking about this in the media, I keep getting asked about Trump's strategy and, the way that he uses escalation in order to de-escalate. So, he makes an outrageous threat in order to drag his enemy to the table and to negotiate on his terms. And this is often framed as the Richard Nixon approach to foreign policy, the madman theory of international relations, where you make your enemy think that you will do anything, that you might do anything, do something crazy. You might commit a genocide in order to get what you want, in order to drag them to the table. It doesn't sound like you think that's what Trump is doing.
No, I don't think that there is any standard logic behind it. That's why I do think, in that classical Greek sense, he's demonstrating the characteristics of the idiot, somebody who has a totally private, personal view of the world that excludes all external realities. So it's not a question of escalating to de-escalate. That's sort of tantamount to saying, I'm going to beat the protagonist senseless so that they can't respond to anything. Or I'm going to beat my head against the wall till it hurts so much that when I do stop, I get this wonderful euphoria of having no more pain. I mean, they're senseless, pointless positions to have, but they have a kind of infinitesimal logic to them. And I think what most of us are trying to do is to make sense out of the senseless. You know, the Canadian philosopher Bernard Lonergan used an expression, the inverse insight. And that is, interestingly, the insight you have when there is no insight to be had. And it's a sharp view, I think, of what we're trying to deal with at the moment. It makes no sense. So the worst thing we can do is to impose sense on it, because we're certain to be wrong. Emma, where we are at the moment, I think, is that in a world of chaos, we've got to look for where the escape hatch might be. I think what we've got to do is to understand that we remain in the midst of chaos until somebody decides that chaos is not the way to go forward. And there's, first of all, a separation, a pause, a ceasefire. That would be really good. And then come to a negotiation table so that people can set out what the conditions for ending chaos might look like. We haven't reached there yet. And if we're lucky, tomorrow in Islamabad, the Iranians and the Americans, through their interlocutors or together, we don't even know what the dynamics of that conversations are going to be yet, they will come to a point where they're going to say, it's not worth destroying the region and imposing an enormous economic recession on the world. What we need to do is to slow this down and begin talking. That would be, I think, the best outcome from tomorrow, and I think it will be very difficult to reach. Failing that, I think we've only got two possibilities. One would be stalemate, that they can't even agree on the things that they're going to start with, and failing that, a walkout. And if it's a walkout, then it simply leaves the international community carrying the burden of the problems. These are massive economic burdens that the global community is carrying as a result of American strategic initiatives. So it's for America to think about the damage it's causing, not just to itself, but to the community of the world. And for that international community to get enough heft behind it to get the UN Security Council to start exercising the responsibilities and powers that it has under the UN Charter. And I can't see that happening in the very short term.
I guess just on that question of the escape hatch, what do you think are the incentives at play here? Because, it would seem to me that the Iranian regime doesn't necessarily have incentives pointing towards that escape hatch, because strategically, they appear to have the upper hand. You know, you mentioned the Strait of Hormuz there, and the way that Trump seems to want to get out. Like he seems to want this to be over. So are there incentives for the Iranians, do you think, to find that escape hatch?
Oh, I think there are, because the Iranian regime is domestically in a difficult position when its own population is still being bombed by both Israel and potentially by America. I think America has wound it back a bit, but Israel's still firing missiles and things at the civil population, as it is in Lebanon, which is not immaterial to this. Okay. And I think it's not just because Hezbollah are friends of Iran. I think it's much more complicated than that. It is that Iran itself remains a power in the Middle East. And if it has a friend, it is going to make sure that the rest of the players in the Middle East know that Iran is capable of doing things to support their friends. So I think Iran has got a number of really important objectives out of this, the most important being that its own power and responsibility within the Middle East must be recognised. America has got the same problem, curiously, and the resolution to both the problem of Iran and America falls in the same space, that they have to back off from each other in order for their own credibility to be maintained. And this sort of competition between the United States and Iran for regional credibility is an important one. And of course, this is where Netanyahu is particularly able to moderate that relationship to his own ends and to the disadvantage of both of the others.
And it does seem, Allan, there you rightly focused on Netanyahu and the Israeli government. It does seem that the interests there appear to be prolonging this conflict. Netanyahu immediately said that Lebanon wasn't included in this ceasefire, initiated a huge wave of strikes that killed 300 people in a very short amount of time, injured over 800, prompted the International Committee of the Red Cross, which very rarely makes political statements, to condemn the death and the destruction in Lebanon. So Netanyahu appears committed to kind of keeping Trump involved and engaged in this conflict. Is that what he is doing, do you think?
Well, that's the effect of what he's doing.
Yeah.
So in a very real sense, that is what he's doing. But I think he's actually playing a much more dangerous game here, in that he's playing on the indecision of Donald Trump, who's, as we said earlier in our conversation, his point of decision is only himself. It's not about effects. This is why the question of is there an exit strategy is an irrelevant question. Is there an outcome? Irrelevant. What is the strategic purpose of all of this? Irrelevant. The whole purpose of it is just the exercise of decision, more or less random, by the president himself. Netanyahu understands that, in my opinion, and is able to play it really, really well, because he keeps the whole of the rest of the Middle East and the rest of the international community off balance. And that includes the leaders of Europe. They don't know what to do. It includes the leaders of look at our own leadership, out barracking for the inclusion of Lebanon as part of the consideration that needs to be addressed tomorrow. And yet, with Israel saying, no, it's not, and J.D. Vance saying, well, the inclusion of Lebanon is an understandable error on the part of the Iranians, the Lord only knows what people are going to be able to agree on, even as a starting point tomorrow in Islamabad. And that's why I do think that the current situation is so perilous.
Well, let me be absolutely clear. He is clearly disappointed and with many NATO allies, and I can see his point.
When President Trump threatened to kill the entire Iranian civilization, did that bother you at all as a diplomat?
Well, what I always say when it comes to what leaders are saying, I'm not commenting on everything. What I want you to know is that I support the president, and I know large parts of Europe do, when it comes to taking out the capacity of Iran to export chaos.
Is the world safer today than it was before the war was started?
Absolutely.
Allan, let's talk about the global community now and how the rest of the world is responding or really not responding to what all of these players are doing in the Middle East. Trump has just met with the Secretary General of NATO. He's been particularly strong again about NATO letting him down and the United States potentially withdrawing from NATO. What do you make of this, the Secretary General of NATO's performance in still apparently kind of attempting to appease Trump?
Well, Emma, whether the words appease or placate or whatever, I think that Secretary General Rutte is showing himself to be a particularly weak player. Because what he won't do is stand up for the interests of the NATO community as a whole, which actually includes the interests of the United States. Yeah. He seems not able to say to President Trump, in our opinion, you are not acting in the interests of the United States, Mr. President. And if you act in the interests of the United States, you will be acting in our interests also. That is the nature of alliances, Mr. President. I mean, that's Alliance Management 101, really. And the NATO leaders have got to understand that. In a curious way, the threat that Trump has applied to NATO, that those NATO members that have American forces stationed within their territory run the risk of having those forces withdrawn, and he'll find other NATO members in which he will deploy his forces. That, I think, would bring much of this to the head, because the fact is that not everybody enjoys having American forces deployed on their territory, and not everybody welcomes the deployment of future American forces on theirs.
Yeah.
So that would cause the NATO organisation really to think about the current utility of forward deployments by the United States. Are they necessary? Because Russia, for all of its bluster, is actually pretty weak at the moment. It's not really capable of going to war against Europe, or even giving the Europeans enough cause to have to build up forces quickly. There's bluster going on, but the reality on the ground is that war is the most unlikely occurrence in Europe at the moment, because nobody's strong enough to do it.
Well, if it happens, it's more likely to come from the United States. Trump posted another threat to Greenland just the other day. Today.
That's right. And were it to be the United States attacking the territory of a NATO member, that's the end of NATO. It can't survive. I'm not sure that NATO is not over already.
Yeah.
But NATO is giving the lifespan of this presidency before it takes any profound decision. I think that's what's happening. So in a way, Rutte is dancing around the fire, but not prepared to walk across it. Does he have to walk across it? No, I don't think so. But he could face it a bit more squarely. And I think that's the problem that NATO's got at the moment. A somewhat stronger Secretary General with, I think, a stronger set of instructions. And whether he'd get those from Keir Starmer, I'm not sure right now. He'd probably get something more or less like the instructions he could expect from Australia. Or, placate him, keep him calm. Don't get him calling us out. And if he does call us out in the company of everybody else so that nobody can see us. So long as South Korea and Japan get a mention as well as Australia over in Asia, and so long as NATO is all brought in together, we can all hide behind each other. That, I think, is a very weak negotiating position for all of us, and we should be much more forthright and much more vocal, as Macron tends to be, in calling out the excesses of what appears to be Trump's position. And Carney has come close to doing exactly the same thing. A bit more of that, I suspect, would resonate more broadly in the United States, maybe a bit around Trump's cabinet, for what that's worth. And who knows, Trump himself might feel that it's about time that he just slowed it down a bit.
Any further escalation needs to be outlined what the objective is. So we've called consistently. We haven't changed our position of calling for de-escalation.
The civilization will die tonight. What did you make specifically of that language?
I don't think it's appropriate to use language such as that from the President of the United States. And I think it will cause some concern, which is there.
Allan, I think dancing around the fire is a very apt description for how the Australian government appears to be handling this. We have had the quite extraordinary spectacle, I'm not sure if that's the right word, of the President of the United States literally threatening to commit genocide, and the Australian Prime Minister describing that as inappropriate language. I think you quite clearly think that is far from enough of a response. Where do you think Australia should be going with this? How do you think the Australian government should be responding?
Look, I think we should be maintaining the position that if you break it, you own it. We should be saying to President Trump, this is your problem. You didn't consult us on it. We don't want to be in it. Our interests are, in fact, diminished to the extent that we are in it. So what we want to do is what our NATO friends and partners want to do, which is to step back, see the problem resolved, and that requires you to resolve a problem that you started. We can't resolve it because we weren't there in creating it. Now, having said that, we're not seeing, particularly we're not seeing Australia doing that. And just this morning, and remember, we are on Friday, the 10th of April, we heard the acting Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, being in Singapore, dealing with fuel, which is an immediate consequence of Trump's intemperate actions, I think, in the Gulf. We're seeing the acting Prime Minister saying, we are now talking to our NATO partners about how we could contribute to whatever they might feel that they need to do in the Gulf. That is completely the wrong strategy. Having said already that we're not going to, we then begin reversing our position and heading down the path of some kind of placating of President Trump, or even worse, some form of walking away from an earlier decision in principle. So I think at the moment, Australia has got an important, pivotal decision to make. And that decision is stay separate from this issue. The global consequences are already so profound that to contribute to the prolongation of the problem will solve nobody's difficulties. Trump has got to face the reality that it's got to stop, and that it won't be stopped by having NATO or anybody else come in and try then to confront Iran about who controls the Strait of Hormuz. Emma, just remember that 3 weeks ago, Iran did not control the Strait of Hormuz. This week, Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. So apart from the enormous economic consequences of Trump's decisions on the global community, we've had a change in strategic positioning in the Gulf, which has got deeply, deeply difficult, fabulously difficult long-term consequences for everybody. If Iran ends up tolling everyone who brings their ships in and out of the Straits of Hormuz, they are effectively applying Trumpian tariffs to the global community in the field of energy. Yeah. Who started that?
Yeah. Well, that's right, Allan. We might have a president of the United States who's overseeing the end of free, stable and open ocean trade, which is a system that underpinned and grew American prosperity and American power for decades. It is all as stupid as it seems. Thank you for explaining that to us, as usual, with such clarity and such generosity. I'm sure we'll have you back very soon. Hopefully we won't have to re-record this on Monday. In the meantime, Allan, thank you again. Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you, Emma.
Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. If you want to hear more from me, I'm on the PET podcast with Chaz Licciardello this week, so the real sickos among you can listen for a full 3 hours and 19 minutes. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can reach us via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Friday the 10th of April. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.